Yeah, well, let's try to keep all awake, talk about this rather important issue of inequality, which actually I spoke about in the first session. So I'm just going to get some highlights from a very excellent paper that was written by my colleague Dr. Vagisha Gunasekara, and which I will be available online, isn't it? So focusing on inequality is not just is basically a question of social justice, and it cuts across all the development goals. I also said in the morning that in South Asia in particular, the disparities of wealth and poverty makes social justice, inequality, a really important issue. The post-2015 debates are currently they've made a shift towards leaving, with the term is leaving no one behind. So one assumes that is also a way of including inequality and into their discussions. The high-level panel report explores how inequality and discrimination restrict opportunities for upward socioeconomic mobility and how they create poverty. The report also talks about the need for disaggregated data and paying particular attention to the bottom 20%. I think this is quite important because we've been talking about how to achieve these equality goals, and if we need to think about whether we need to have goals and targets that look at paying particular attention to the bottom 20%. But at the same time, the high-level panel report also suggests that national policy in each country and not a global goal should tackle the issue of income inequality. So that's something I think we need to debate and think whether that's really what we want on the agenda. There have been some responses to this, and I'm pleased that we have Cyrene, Siriwardhana here with us, because when the HLP report was released in May, OXFAM responded saying that the panel has failed to recognize the growing consensus that high levels of inequality are both morally repugnant and damaging for growth and stability. So there's a moral argument for being inclusive, but there is also, as we talked in the morning, an importance for growth and stability for being inclusive as well. And as I said in the morning, this is also something that has been acknowledged by the managing director of the IMF, who publicly stated that rising income inequality is a growing concern for policymakers around the world. There are other aspects coming from an equality perspective on the high-level panel report. One is that it separates the general the kind of factors that we associate with poverty and inequality, like household income, gender, location, ethnicity, age, or disability, access to health, nutrition, education, and services, from other aspects of inequality more relevant to social inclusion, such as security of tenure, access to justice, issues like that. And they talk about it as two separate phenomena. And I think if you're talking about inequality, we cannot just have these, we need to talk about discrimination, we need to talk about social inclusion, we need to talk about those issues as well. And I believe that in her paper, Dr. Nidhi Sabharwal, who will talk a lot about group rights and individual rights, and talk about indigenous, ethnic, and other excluded groups and how their poverty profiles and their malnutrition, illiteracy, and poor health outcomes are compared to the rest of the general population. So this is about discrimination that comes not just from an economic perspective, but from also a social perspective. Another issue that we need to consider, and again this was sort of put on the table in the morning, is the fact that there are different kinds of interests, and they lead to some interests being privileged over others. So one of the major things is about corporate interests versus citizens' interests. And one of the criticisms about the high-level panel report is that maybe it does not really account for the fact that these two might actually be contrary to each other. We have also a paper in this session from Dr. Bhola Bhattarai from Nepal, and he provides an example of an alternative. Dr. Bhattacharya talked in the morning about, so what is this thinking out of the box, what is this new thinking that we can bring to the table, and there is some thinking happening around what is being called the social and solidarity economy. I called it the sort of issue of the commons, and I think Mr. Bhattarai will talk about it in terms of community forestry in Nepal. Again, something else that I raised in the earlier in the morning session, which I think really needs to we need to think about when we talk about inequality, is that there are already principles and conventions that actually deal with things like the guiding principles on human rights and extreme poverty. There's all the conventions relating to women and to children. And the whole sort of discussion at the moment is looking at women's rights though it is actually bringing women's rights onto the agenda, it's looking at it in a very utilitarian perspective, and not from the perspective of the fact that it's a right of a citizen. So we need to really think about that as well. So basically those are some of the key issues that I would like to highlight from the background to this on inequality in this session. And I think we can get a lot more onto through the discussion, because we have a really interesting group of two presenters and a very dynamic group of discussants. So before I will begin by asking Dr. Nidhi Sabharwal to actually make her presentation. Nidhi is director of the Indian Institute of Dalit Studies in New Delhi, and holds a PhD in geography from the Jawaharlal Nehru University. She is, I mean, the Institute of Dalit Studies in itself is focused on the issue of discrimination and inequality. So we will start.
Thank you. I have it on this laptop, but it's not coming here.
Yeah, no, they'll do. It'll come.
All right. Thanks. Thank you very much. And I'll stick to my 10 minutes that are allotted to me. Because of that, I will give an overview of the paper that I've submitted, and I think it's in your pen drive. So, and in this presentation, and I'll promise that I will try not to bore you, and not so that you don't sleep. So in this presentation, I will present our work on the progress of MDGs for the excluded groups and equity issues. And the policy approach. The second would be the policy approach that has been adopted by the Indian government in India to address the concerns of the excluded groups, and the policy recommendations for the post-2015 MDGs to reduce disparities. So I'll be using a lot of nomenclatures, for example, which is quite, it's used regularly in Indian context. The excluded groups are scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. So SCs and STs shot of that. So I'll be using a lot of that SCs and STs. These are the excluded groups in India include the former untouchables. So the scheduled caste are the former untouchable in the caste system, tribes, religious minorities such as Muslims and Christians, and women from the excluded groups who experience multiple deprivation due to their gender and group identity, the intersecting inequalities. So there is an official schedule of caste and tribes referred to as respectively scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. So it's an official schedule. On the back of the constitutional provisions, the government has enacted laws that address different forms of discrimination, and there are laws to address issues of untouchability and protects the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes against atrocities, as well as there are many benefit social welfare programs for the excluded groups. So coming to the progress of MDGs in India is the following. Between 1993-2010, that's the latest round of data, official data that we have currently, the incidence of poverty in India declined across social and economic groups. The trend analysis of malnutrition indicates that there has been an improvement for all social groups, including the most excluded groups of the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. So this is poverty and malnutrition. Similarly, development indicators such as literacy rates, infant mortality rates, full immunization, maternal health indicators, access to drinking water, access to sanitation, access to drainage has improved. But however, the rate of improvement in MDGs was lower for scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, and the gap remains. And in literacy, the dropout rates they continue to be high. So there are 2 points. There has been an improvement. However, the rate of improvement has been lower as to the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe as compared to high caste, except in poverty, where poverty has improved, has declined at a faster rate as compared to the rest of the population. So much of the poverty and hunger and deprivation of indigenous and excluded groups is the result of factors, and this is widely recognized in literature now, which are the factors which are common to all poor, including the poor from the excluded groups. The general factors known to cause poverty includes lack of increase in income of the poor, lack of access to assets like agricultural land, non-agricultural enterprises, gainful employment, education and skill, health facility, housing, and lack of participation in governance. Ultimately, these factors conflate and cause poverty for all poor, including the poor from the excluded groups. However, in case of the discriminated groups, although similar factors are the ultimate cause of low income and poverty, in their case, there are group-specific factors which excluded groups face and become vulnerable to poverty than their counterpart from the general population. So the group-specific factor which are known to affect the excluded groups relate to exclusion in the past, historical exclusion, and denial of rights and entitlements in the present. In fact, inequalities caused by exclusion and discrimination limits the prospect of poverty reduction among certain excluded groups. So what this really means that this right of entitlements, denial of rights of entitlements bring lack of ownership of assets and all other factors that create poverty. The resultant consequence is poverty. I just got distracted because I've got only 5 minutes. And the studies shows that even for identical groups, likelihood of scheduled caste children being malnourished was 1.4 times that of children from the general caste when controlled for income, education of the mother, health services. There are differences in the longevity as measured by age at death. The average age of death of Dalit women at 39.5 years was nearly 15 years less than that of the non-scheduled caste scheduled tribe women. And this is controlling for all available factors. Thus, it is constraints for the excluded group are also associated with exclusion due to their group identity. So it's exclusion-induced deprivation, the social group identity, the identity of the group that excludes them. These constraints have been recognized in the planning process in India. Plans are drawn up to ensure upliftment of specific groups, such as these excluded groups, minorities, and other marginalized groups. The 11th and the 12th plan have adopted 25 monitorable targets as key features of inclusive growth strategy. And this has been a feature in the 11th and the 12th plan even before the MDGs came into discussion. So the planning process has these 25 monitorable targets. Individual states have also been encouraged to set state-specific targets in this area, and narrowing the gap between scheduled caste or scheduled tribes and the general population is a part of the definition of inclusiveness in the planning process. And this is something that I've quoted from the plan. So, and just to highlight that the plan does address that proactive intervention to bridge the many divides which society as an important objective of inclusiveness. The specific approach of the Indian policy makers to address exclusion and upliftment of the poor, of the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe, the poor are, there are measures against discrimination, there are laws, then there are affirmative action policies in the form of reservation in public sector, employment in public education, as well as in political participation. So this is affirmative action. In addition, there are general policies of upliftment and empowerment and capacity enhancement policies and welfare programs that also address the that general poor, which includes the poor from the discriminated groups. So the policy approach for post-2015 MDGs, so that no one is left behind. Commitment to deal with inequalities. So placing the need of the marginalized groups at the heart of the policy guidance in defining the next set of global goals for poverty reduction and sustainable development. So the heart of the policy guidance needs to include the needs of marginalized groups. And this is a commitment in the high-level panel report. The policy recommendation has to be in a combination. It has to be a combination of policies. General policies to reduce poverty and enhance capabilities, and affirmative action policies to address human poverty, reduce disparities, and to ensure non-discriminatory access and participation of the excluded group. So non-discriminatory access and participation, it becomes one of the main feature ingredient in the inclusive growth process. And institutionalizing disaggregated tracking of development targets and progress of poverty reducing programs by community groups and gender to ensure social inclusion. Disaggregated tracking. We really need to disaggregate data and track it in order to ensure that social inclusion is possible. And this disaggregated data has to be across social groups as well as gender. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's given us some really practical suggestions almost to adopt, not just from the Indian experience, and I think we could come back to that in the discussion and after we've heard. So I will go, without asking you to hold your questions, I will go to Mr. Bhola Bhattarai, who is a social activist and the current chairman of the National Forum for Advocacy Nepal, NAFAN. So, Mr. Bhattarai.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Actually, this is the presentation from my own experiences working in community forestry since last 20 years, from my own village to national level. So it is not the academic type of presentation. This is just the experience from the bottom, and which will be useful for the MDG and post-MDG process. So today I'm going to talk about this, social solidarity economy, which is a linkage with, community forestry process in Nepal. First of all, I would like to talk about the characteristics of social solidarity economy. We all are engaging with different cooperatives. We have a mutual society, different association, voluntary organization, which is a part of the social solidarity economy, who are promoting social economy. They are producing something from their own process, from their own resources, and they are using those products for their own livelihood. So these are the things we can identify the characteristics of social solidarity economy. Social enterprises are there, different foundations, which is also a part of social solidarity economy. So the goal of social solidarity economy is to serve the member of the community, the member who are in the process, to for the financial profits. And it is also a kind of social enterprises which is supporting the social financial institution. They make their organization themselves, so that they can do for themselves. They do not expect from outsider. So that is what we learn from social solidarity economy process. So it is also help to ensure the participation of users, and it is also a priority to people who work over capital in the distribution of revenue and surplus. And this social solidarity economy focus to create a forum based on principles of participation, empowerment, and individual and collective responsibility. So these are the things we learn from social solidarity economy principles and goals. Then we are trying to relate these social solidarity in the context of forest management in Nepal. You can see, the context of different policy process in Nepal. After 1990s, the different global economy came into the local, tried to integrate with local scales. And we also, bear the civil war, 12 years civil war in Nepal. And right now, our government have a interim government constitution, which is also have a 3 years development plan, and which is trying to support for creating employment, ensure high economic growth. So this is the context. And in the same time, social solidarity economy is also trying to, what do we say? It is a kind of economy. Like it is against, or it is trying to transform the economic process. It is the like old bank model, the neoliberal old bank model development, and social solidarity economy is going to be parallelly happening in the context of the Nepal. Like government and other agencies trying to impose their development agenda, and we community people trying to develop our own model. So this is what we are trying to implement, so that in the discussing about the MDG and post MDG or after 2015, then from our own experience, we need to see what is the community are trying to enhance, what process and approach trying to enhance by the community. So you can see the cooperatives and different other groups are trying to emerge and trying to develop new model of economy. So social solidarity economy is one of the approach which is it is a kind of informal ways of exchanging goods and services, and it is also a collective responsibility of performing rituals, collective savings. We have a long history of Dhikuti system, like a collective saving systems. We call it Dhikuti. We have Parma, Guti, different types of social solidarity economic process is existing, and we are trying to promote those experiences, which is our own experience from long history. And right now, different groups, different cooperatives, different user groups are trying to institutionalize themselves. Then if we promote them, then it will be sustainable. Otherwise, we just bring something from outsider, then we cannot survive, or we cannot institutionalize our process. So based on these things, we talk about the global vision of SSE, social solidarity economy. It is a ownership feeling in resources. We talk about the tenure rights. We talk about value chain governance, local level value addition and employment opportunities. These are the things we are talking about in the social solidarity. So based on that, forest user groups is one of the good model which we are experiencing since 20 years in Nepal. You can see, we have different types of forest regimes, forest management regimes. Out of total forest area, around 25% of Nepal forest is managing and utilizing by local forest user groups. We call it community-based forest user groups. So it means they have their rights to form forest user groups, they have their rights to fix price, they have rights to form organization, they can sell their product themselves. They don't have to ask with other people, like government or other institution. This is the process we are evolving. So community, right now we have 20,000 forest user groups all across the country. Different groups have different type of dimension. You can see, we are talking about the social inclusion. You can see 50% women participation is ensured in the all forest user groups. In the position, all are equal. It is mandatory to have 50% women in all each and every forest users committee. And about the Dalits, indigenous peoples, it is also mandatory that all the population should be included in the process as well as in the benefit sharing. So this is what we are developing from our own process. And out of total forest, 1.8 million hectare is under community forestry. It is about 33% of national forest, and about 40% of the national population are getting benefit from the community forestry process. So, so we are trying to see the the linkage with social solidarity. We have different policy and programs which is supporting to promote social solidarity economy through community forestry or community-based forestry. So community forestry user groups are the basic policy, basic principle was it is for the local needs supply and biodiversity conservation, employment generation and livelihood development. Right now, when we talk about employment and livelihood, the forest user groups are trying to shift to the green economy. It means they are producing different goods and services. They are producing those product and they are selling and they are creating different jobs, which is we are discussing about decent job. Forest user groups themselves are creating job and they are providing support to the poor people who are the member of forest user groups. If we see the characteristics of different forest user groups, we can see all forest user groups have right over the resources. It is clearly mentioned in the Forest Act and Forest Regulation. We have very good power balances in forest user groups. We are talking about social justice. This is the only one organization in the grassroots level which is promoting democracy, grassroots democracy, and which is supporting to make a social justice in the grassroots level. So you can see a lot of good characteristics in community forestry. Many years ago, means 20-25 years ago, most of the hill region of Nepal was totally degraded. All the hills were totally naked, and right now all these things is becoming green. Means population is growing, but the forest is also being green. So one of the experts was saying that plant grow in the organization, not in the soil. So this is what we learn from this process. We have very good, achievements. Yeah. So right now, a lot of women and the poor people are getting job from within the different processing company. We have a non-timber forest product. We have furniture industries, and they are producing those products and they are selling. They are creating job. They are providing opportunity. So. Yeah, time is very short. So, yeah, regarding the environmental, the enabling environment for the NTFP value chain, the consumer trend is shifting and market trend and competition is there. Royalty rates, we are trying to bargain with government to fix the right royalty rates. We are also working with the export regulation, policy practice and quality standard. We are trying to enhance capacity of local people in relation to this issue. So main issues we are trying to see is the land tenure is the main issue, that still the government is not ready to hand over the land to the local people. The forest is handed over to the community, but land is not handed over. So we are trying to ask government to hand over those land, forest land to the community. and still we need to, promote and enhance the participation and involvement of different groups, different, marginalized community, and we also need to enhance the governance. So finally, what I want to say is, if we try to relate with this post-MDG, we need to talk about the access and control over resources. So we need to, ask how we, talk or raise the issues to hand over those land to the poor people, and which will support for the sustainable forest management. It is only the possibility to, if we hand over the forest area to the local community with their capacity, then it will conserve the forest. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry we had to rush you, but I'm sure you can come back to some of the information in the discussion. I think this was really interesting to have Mr. Bhattarai's presentation, because we've been talking about not having the southern voice in the global conversation. How much of the community voice do we have in ours? So I think this shows that there is, when I first started working, I had a thing over desk which said it is not, it may be your project, but it is their life. And I think this is an example of how people are not just waiting around for us to come with an MDG solution or a development solution. People also have to work to have their own solutions. And how much of that can we incorporate, or how much can our thinking benefit from these kind of initiatives? So I think thank you very much for that. We have now 3 discussants. I think Amjad is probably not, Salim is not probably going to turn up. He's the coordinator and media liaison for the Commonwealth People's Forum, which is probably stressing him out more than anything else at the moment. So I am sorry he's not here. But we have 3 very eminent, kind of a very interesting and very wide experienced women on the discussion panel. One is Mrs. Cyrene Siriwardhana, who is a lawyer, I think, and has an MA in law from Oxford, and is now working as the policy and advocacy manager of OXFAM, Australia in Sri Lanka. We have Pooja Parvati, who is leading the Vadana Thodu Abhiyan campaign for the post-2015 development agenda since January this year, which is a campaign in India. And we have Shyama Salgado, who has been working for the ILO for a long time, and who has been working on the decent jobs agenda, on the green jobs agenda. So we have 3 very interesting perspectives to respond to Nidhi's and Bhola's presentations. Which one of you would like to go first? Cyrene? Or who's ready? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Priyanthi. I did have a look at the papers and I found them extremely fascinating, as well as Vagisha's paper, which I thought was an excellent sort of context setting on the whole issue of equality. And I had some comments on the papers, but before I go to that, I would like to really challenge some of the thinking that came out in the morning session. I didn't intervene then because I thought, well, I'll get my chance as discussant, so let the others have a go. And that discussion was very rich. And I'm very sorry that Dr. Bhattacharya is not here, because what I wanted to...
watching the streaming from somewhere else.
Okay. So well, maybe he'll see it at another time, because I really wanted to challenge some of what came out of that discussion, because I completely understand the purpose of this these 2 days is really to look at the issues that we do face in South Asia, but in a way that will help to inform the framework of the post-2015 MDGs. So I think we're all clear that that is our purpose. What I felt in the morning session, however, is that when the discussion moved more towards sort of exclusion, inequality into rights, there was some level of discomfort that this is not something that we can really integrate, that is a kind of the last sort of frontier. which I would beg to disagree with. And I'm taking up this challenge with some trepidation because I am not an economist, I'm a lawyer, and who has only recently actually come into the development field. But I think it's a sort of a false dichotomy, really, because when we talk of development, I think we are all entirely sort of, we have bought in entirely into the rights-based approach. I don't think any one of us here would deny that we approach development with a strong rights-based approach. So what does that mean? If we are looking at an institution like the UN, which has come up with these Millennium Development Goals, which are looking to redefine them now post-2015, and it is the same institution that has come up with a series of covenants and conventions, which Priyanthi alluded to in the morning, on human rights, on rights of development, on the rights of women, on the rights of the child, and we say that they take up these two agendas in entirely separate ways, I think we have to start questioning that. And let me start, actually, there were so many starting points, but I just want to start with something that I think Dr. Andrew Scott mentioned in the morning, which was, he said that in the course of the last 20 years, we have come more towards a recognition that growth is, economic growth is more means to wider objectives. I'd like to interrogate that a little. What does that mean? So what are the wider objectives that we are going to? We are not looking at growth to say we have achieved this amount of growth. These are our figures. We are actually trying to make differences in the lives of people. So if we are actually saying that growth is a means, it's a means for me to an end to inequality. And that I would like to throw a pause for discussion. I mean, how would you view that? And that is where the whole social exclusion, moving towards inequalities within inequalities, I think, comes in. And if we are going to challenge that and say that, well, we are all about ending inequalities, we are all about sort of taking out the poorest of the poor from the poor and attending to their needs as opposed to the poor who are just above the poorest of the poor, then I think we are talking of rights. So I think I'd really like to urge all of you who take the dialogue forward not to have this divorce between these two. And then it takes me also back to what Priyanthi was saying about social justice. And this idea of a moral obligation. So when does it go beyond being a moral obligation? When does it become something more than, oh, it's so nice for the next generation? It can't be just that. It has to be grounded in something much more concrete. And there I would like to actually move into some of the things that Vagisha's paper had raised. And I'm going to use the gender perspective as really an illustration because she mentions, and Priyanthi also alluded to this, that she talks of gender as the most pervasive of challenges, even among those disadvantaged by other forms of equality. But she also critiques the approach of the MDGs to women's rights and says that they are instrumental, they're more like add women and stir as opposed to recognizing them for what they are, women's rights as human rights. So now if that is a critique, I think then we are getting to the stage where there's some sort of a mismatch between the human rights agenda and the development agenda, and I think there's an implicit recognition there. Is that 5 minutes more I have? Oh, okay. That we need to bring these closer together. So I think we can't get into an inherent contradiction here that actually we can't impose human rights agendas on governments, they will then never buy into the goals, and then say we are using a rights-based. I know I'm making it a little bit simplistic, and you can't go to a government and say you have to do all of these things on human rights. But I think as long as we accept that there is this definite underlying imperative that we do that, then we can't get beyond this point. If we have that recognition, then I think we can find ways around that. And I think a very good way around that is a focus on governance. And I think when Dr. Bhattarai laid out the sort of different models on the MDGs, and one was where governance came as a fourth pillar. So the whole question of do you have it as a standalone or does it feed into the others? I think it can be both. I think if you have it as a standalone pillar, but find ways to link it to each of the three as well, then I think you can, to some extent, address that whole issue of, the things we discussed in the morning, democracy and development. So what does it mean? They have to go together. And that, again, is a little bit like gender. You can mainstream or integrate gender into all your programs and yet have gender justice or women's empowerment as a separate goal. So that's few sort of suggestions, I think, about how we can get beyond this sort of impasse.
You probably have about a minute more.
I have 1 minute more? 1 minute? Or?
4 minutes.
4 minutes. That's not too bad. Yeah. So, right. If I can then just move to the couple of points on the papers, both of which I thought were very interesting. I was quite struck by the affirmative action point that you made, because I think that's, again, a way that we can address this thing of inequalities amongst those who are already very disadvantaged. But one of the points that Dr. Sabharwal makes is that affirmative action policies are directed at the state. And she makes a point that, and I think this didn't come out so much in your presentation, but it was in your paper, what about the huge private sector where most of the employment and economic activities are happening? And that, again, is, I think, something that we need to address, because, again, we have that issue of the citizens as the rights holders, the government as the duty bearers to take forward development and ensure rights and all of that. And yet you have a whole another growing group of private, national, and multinational corporate sector entities whose accountability is not very clear. Finally, on the social solidarity economic model on community forest management, I think that's a great way to bring in environment sustainability, and I think we can learn a lot. Countries like Sri Lanka can learn a lot from that model. But it's also something, I think, where countries like Nepal could heed a little bit of warning from what's been happening in countries like Sri Lanka, where with increasingly increased reliance on tourism for our economy and increasing infrastructure development projects, some of these gains might be lost. And you need to, I think, find a way to preserve the best of your model while taking into account all the changes that will, I think, inevitably come. The other thing interesting for me about the community forestry model is the whole also linked with conflict. And there's a gender intersection as well, because just one of our experiences in Sri Lanka is that war destroys almost everything, but one thing that grows in war are forests, because forests are a cover for armed groups. So in that sense, we know that the environment in that sense grew, or forests certainly grew in the last 30 years. But what is happening now is the forests, also with the rest of the economic opportunities being destroyed, forests became a resource for many, many of our people, and particularly for women. And now with military and other restrictions, as well as large-scale development projects, there is some conflict, there is some tension between economic opportunities and forest resources. So I think we can learn, and Taruka might have some ideas about that as well, how we can learn from these kinds of models for our own context, because we certainly haven't taken on this community forestry model in anywhere near the scale that Nepal has. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Pooja, would you like to say something?
Good afternoon, and thank you. I think Ms. Siriwardhana more or less sums up my concerns as well that I had from the first session. And I'd like to congratulate both the presenters. The papers were really excellent, and some concerns did come up. But in my submission here, I would just like to maybe add on a little bit to what has been already said. First off, I mean, coming from the perspective of, rights-based campaigner, somebody who has been looking at budgets from a lens of social exclusion and discrimination, I would say that there is a need to move beyond being merely transactional to actually being transformative or transformational. So, interestingly, the UN SDGs report is the one that kind of sets the ball rolling on this, because he states out up front that there's a need to kind of focus on social justice, human rights, address exclusion, and provide dignity for all. which essentially translates to social inclusion. And this he draws not only from the UN Millennium Declaration, but also moves beyond way back in 1945 to the UN Charter, where it kind of lays the premise for the entire being of the UN to kind of promote human development as based on human rights, inclusion and equitable principles. So it is clearly a matter of concern when we are looking at the present discourse, where we are moving clearly more towards, partnerships that are more in the neoliberal sort of entrepreneurial macroeconomic frame, where maybe the accountability mechanisms, maybe the kind of systemic measures that need to be nuanced a little bit more, need to be seen and addressed much more, affirmatively and right out up front. And this also relates clearly to issues such as sustainable, development, sustainability, peace building, just governance. I mean, moving beyond good governance to just, where justice is the principle, just governance, and to even alleviating inequality. The second is to do with the need to revisit, which is again just related, but just I thought it's important to underscore that, to revisit the the current ongoing macroeconomic policy framework that is prevalent mostly in most of the countries, and more so in the global south and developing country context, where we see that the role of state institutions has been greatly minimized. And this is particularly of a matter of concern, given that most of the entitlements that we're talking of, which we might have labeled as essential services now, but even so, education, health, food and nutrition security, we talked of food sovereignty in the morning, so all of these come within the purview of the government and their provisions. So, I mean, it needs to be seen in that context. And just to quote one very small, figure, I'd like to just quote about the Gini coefficient and taking India's case. From 1980-81 to 2011-12, the Gini coefficient has increased from 0.15 to 0.25. And this is also at the same time where we are talking of India shining, extreme, exceptional growth phases, etc. But then we also see that inequality is the predominant sort of, it's there for all of us to see. Thirdly, I think Priyanthi has already talked about it, relates to corporate accountability, the need to look at that. And in that comes the associated principles of, again, what my earlier panelist has also talked of, good governance, just governance, where we look at issues of transparency, accountability, and participation, and weave in the whole process indicator as well. So while content is very important, it's also important to see how we have arrived at the content. Now just 6 illustrations, or maybe 4 or 5, to look at specific areas pertaining to equity and sustainability. And I'm just borrowing, I'm taking reference from the high-level panel report, because that more or less forms the frame for the open working group to take up, what recommendations would they have for the new formulations in the form of goals. First off, again, there was a lot of discussion in the morning on the adoption of $1.25 a day as a benchmark for measuring poverty. That is fundamentally, a problematic issue, more from, global south, developing country context again, because what is happening is countries like India have actually moved from a much more, a better poverty benchmark to something closer to $1.25 a day. And that clearly, it's a way of maybe saying that, yeah, we have brought down the numbers of people below poverty line. But then how does it actually translate in terms of what provisions have actually flown? So, and then another thing, of course, all of you have been focusing on the bottom decile, but then it's also important, and I think you did mention about that, to look at the missing middle layer of those who are not maybe below the poverty line, but then who are also not anywhere close to having a dignified or a decent quality of life. Now, to look at some of the principles relating to sustainable energy, sustainability, the high-level panel report again talks of merging MDGs with SDGs. And it focuses by formulating 2 goals on that, one on sustainable energy and the other on sustainable natural resource management. And it is really commendable that the goal 7 talks of, phasing out fossil fuel subsidies and maintaining country-level government and corporate environmental database. But when we look at it a little bit more closer, there is not much coherence with the whole sustainable development framework. The energy goals do not seem to be very coherent, and they're not really ambitious enough, because given the extent of energy poverty and the target of holding rise in global average temperature to keep it below 2 degrees centigrade, doubling renewable energy by as a share of total energy by 2030 might be too little too late. Third point, maybe we'll just skip one or two of them. The third point relates to the whole advocacy towards improvement of energy efficiency, which is again something that the high-level panel report talks of, the SDSN report talks of, and promotion of sustainable agriculture. But it nowhere approaches sustainable agriculture as pathways away from use of fossil fuels, consuming inputs. So where is that link? Maybe that's something that we need to flesh out a bit more. And the expected radical approach to kind of look at energy as promoting sustainability and equity seems to be missing. And again, just to link up the whole gender dimension, it seems specifically pertaining to Global South and countries like ours, our recommendations linking women and energy access, given that women are more efficient, better energy managers, and suffer also the most in the event of inadequate supply. And of course relates to the whole issue of differential trade policies, how women are confronted by these, the impact of those, and also the extent and focus of impact of development assistance to women, and how does it impact gender equality in most of the countries. Another concern, which again the UN report itself, I mean the MDG progress report raises, is to do with the vulnerable employment data, where it shows that it has only reduced very marginally. And as we know, vulnerable employment as a share of total employment, most of those who are affected are again women and youth. So clearly that's again a huge, two constituencies that are very critical and need to be focused on. Finally, the issue relates to, what I would say is important, and again something that links to the whole issue of inclusion, promoting more for greater inclusion and ensuring sustainability, is to bridge the wage disparity gap, which is prevalent and has not been really looked up in any of the UN recommendations till now. That's about it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think that would lead very clearly into what maybe Shyama would like to share with us or comment on from an employment and decent employment perspective.
Okay, first I need to congratulate you. You've done ILO's work in these two papers by bringing together the social justice aspect of environmentally sustainable jobs, especially the second paper. Having said that, I picked out some keywords in both the papers, which is very close to the ILO's agenda on decent work, which is premised upon 8 key or core conventions of the ILO, 2 on forced labor, 2 on employment with freely chosen employment, social protection, and social dialogue, giving voice to the most vulnerable, because we believe that rights flow downhill. And there was a reference to the bottom 20%, which I think is well captured, and what you all talked about in terms of environment, economy, and social justice is packaged by the ILO in its most recent concept of green jobs. And I would like to dwell on that a little bit and see how your paper aligns to the green jobs concept, and that would be my message for the future, like at global level as well as national level. Why I say global level is we've all subscribed to international conventions, including CEDAW, UNCRC, the International Labour Standards, UDHR, and whatever. Nationally, yes, we've ratified, most of us have ratified these conventions, right? So the challenge is in implementing them and bringing them down to this level, and then benchmarking our progress to see whether growth has been holistic. So we are talking of, for example, moving like where the corporate world is concerned, moving from the shareholder to the stakeholder interest. And most of us have been calling these things corporate social responsibility. That is really window dressing. But if you take the triple bottom line of economic viability, social responsibility, and social justice with environmental sustainability, it would go right down to the interest of the stakeholders and the community that you talked about, for example, sir. So that approach is, I mean, something really commendable, and it's a lesson that we can pull out of your paper. There was the issue of conflict versus compatibility and the moral bottom line. You see that you talked about whether the private sector's agenda is really in conflict with the human rights agenda. And I think if you're looking at sustainability to continue your viable economic enterprise so that you can keep people in jobs and in good jobs and in decent work, then you would naturally look at the social justice aspect, because if your employees are unhappy, your productivity is low, and then that is a vicious cycle, right? And if your natural resources are draining and you're not replenishing stocks through reforestation, for example, or putting back, the ILO has a good model in the north about the crab industry, where we have now incubators to send back crabs into the ocean so that there is sustainability there. And that is very soon going to be a benchmark from the demand side, right? So those standards have to be met. And you meet them looking at the fact that those enterprises are going to be sustainable so that jobs are sustainable, you get a decent wage, and therefore you can also divide profits if productivity is high, and it is plowed back to the community who's subscribing to this whole enterprise. There was another issue of, yeah, you talked of green growth in your social solidarity economy model, right? And I really salute you on that one. I wish we could take those to scale, but they have, I'm not sure from when you started it, I missed that one. They have to stand the test of time. And we talked about the cooperatives model, to which the ILO really subscribes to, and we found that it is quite successful. It really lends itself to social justice. And it has been used in the North and East, like you have done there. We have tried models in the North and East, post-conflict, for post-conflict livelihood recovery. I think the fact that you have come up with a homegrown model, something indigenous, something that is close to the heart of your own country, rather than aping something that might not be quite acceptable, is also commendable. And that is the kind of green job that we are looking at also, that is homegrown, therefore sustainable. And of course, trade unionism, very close to the heart of the ILO, has been integrated well. There are two sides to trade unionism. Sometimes in certain countries it becomes almost like a militant union, which comes to that because maybe from the employer's side there is no social justice and you had to shout louder and cry harder to get what you want. But your participatory approach that you talk about and the collective responsibility, these are keywords, and empowerment are what the ILO thinks should go into trade unionism. So we believe in that fourth pillar. We have 4 pillars: international labor standards, freely chosen employment, social protection, and social dialogue. That is key. Social dialogue is really key to ensuring inclusion in the world of work. And of course, gender equality and equity, so that women are brought in, both mainstreaming them as well as lending itself to affirmative action, so that you follow the two streams, the dual streams, in all your interventions for employment creation, employment, and social security issues, including social dialogue. So, well, I think, yeah, I have covered all the key points and the key words I heard in the 2 presentations. Yeah, targeted work. You said I think it was the first person who said targeted work. for women, for marginalized groups, for young persons. And for Sri Lanka, very importantly, because our youth unemployment rate is 17% as opposed to overall unemployment rate of 4%, and or 3.9, I think. And for young women, it's something like 24%. So it is much higher for them. So targeting employment creation, wage employment, even entrepreneurship for young women to ensure social justice is very important. And I think we are not alone in South Asia. So having said that, I would congratulate you again on the 2 papers and think that maybe that's something that ILO would seriously look into for even publishing.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I think we've had a really interesting 5 conversations around the issues of rights, and I think there is a kind of like a consensus that rights, I think what Cyrene brought up, I don't know. I mean, I think we've lost all our hardcore economists. So I'm not sure we are going to be talking to the converted here. But, except maybe. Have we got any hardcore economists left? Nobody's admitting to be one anyway. Okay, but I think we've kind of sort of, I think the House here seems to be in agreement that justice is a common and an underlying and important factor of any framework that has to go. And I want to bring you back into this whole MDG post-2015 framework. So I think we've taken that as a given. But we've also brought in some new ideas, I think, here. We didn't talk very much earlier about this whole state and private sector and the whole private sector issue or of people's initiatives. So I think we brought that in. And I like the conversation about just governance rather than good governance. And I think we might hold that concept till tomorrow morning when we have this session on governance. But if there's now anything else that, I mean, the floor is open. We have 45 minutes almost to debate these issues. So, yes.
3 sort of comments. I think it's important that Cyrene brought in basically the human rights approach. At the same time, I think 80s, before Millennium Development Goals, people were talking about right to development, and developing countries put a lot of effort, and still there in the Human Rights Commission there is a working group on right to development. So I think it's important to approach the development from a human rights perspective, and a lot of jurisprudence have built up in the last 20 years or so. But at the same time, I think it's also a question whether do you want as a goal a human rights thing, because throughout the history, if you look at it, all the time it is used in a way to intervene in developing countries. So that human rights have been used to intervene politically in developing countries. So historically there is a fear from the developing countries' point of view to consider it as making it as a global goal. But at the same time, there is worth to look at development itself as a human right, where you can bring the what you call the concept of justice. And at the same time, I think we should be a bit cautious about this good governance thing. I think a lot of even development economists you have brought in, actually there is no difference, the history shows that, even the corrupt government, they did show a good economic growth and development, and throughout the history of even in USA or even in the late comers like South Korea or even to an extent Japan. So good governance, I think, is not going to ensure you the development. I think it's much more about the policy space that countries can pursue. But I am not saying that, I am not glorifying the domestic corruption or kind of despotism in the government. But I think we should be careful, because good governance, in a way, it has its own context where it's basically shifting the blame while you have neoliberal institutions and neoliberal policies. The only problem is your governance. Rest will, if you have a good governance, it will take care of. But that's not the that's not true, actually. So in a way, good governance has been used to legitimize the neoliberal policies to push through in developing countries. And lastly, on the green jobs, also, I think some groups, even the trade unions, have expressed certain concerns about the green jobs, because earlier it was concerns coming from the green economy when it was suggested in around Rio +20 conference time, mainly because in the absence of technology and finance, how the developing countries are going to meet this kind of transformation from jobs to green jobs. Even they are struggling even to create jobs. So so it's important to have access to technologies and access to finance to make such a transformation. Otherwise, the green jobs, the concept of green jobs and the kind of international obligation you might be taking, it further helps you to maintain the what you call the current unequal international economic architecture. So thanks.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Yes. And
thank you. One comment from me and a couple of comments in response to the papers. The first thing, which hasn't really come up yet, is that when we're thinking about the question of inequality, and particularly the most marginalized groups, who in a sense are the ones at the tail end of the move towards leaving no one behind. It's worth reflecting on, first of all, some of the forecasts that have been done in the modeling of poverty in the future, all of which suggest that certainly in the South Asia region, the number of people on less than 125 a day in 2030 is still going to be somewhere between 50 million and 150 million. And that means, unless there's changes in policies and direction, that will be what we're faced with. And of course, those are the people who are going to be the most marginalized and facing discrimination. The second aspect on the poverty side is that we need to remember that poverty is not a sort of static concept, that people move in and out of poverty. And one of the features that we need to be thinking about for the future, I think particularly in the face of climate change, is the extent to which there will be forces that impoverish people. We're always talking about bringing people up to a certain level, but actually there are going to be forces that are going to push people down below the poverty line. And again, it's going to be those who are discriminated against and most marginalized who are going to experience that first. In response to the papers, two points came up. The first on the human rights question, I think we need to, first of all, remember that the post-2015 agreement on goals is going to be a non-binding agreement, as was the MDG agreement, the Millennium Declaration, which means that anything that's agreed there is up to national governments to decide whether or not they're going to take it up or not. Picking up on Dr. Bhattacharya's point earlier about trying to if you like, protect certain things, the question then for me would be, if we're looking to have human rights expressed in the post-2015 agreement, is that opening up debate about whether already agreed rights are open to question? We already have human rights legally binding under a number of international agreements signed by the same member states who are going to be agreeing the post-2015 agreement. By introducing it into the post-2015 debate as a sort of goal, that the potential is opened up for whether or not we're going to backtrack on some of the things that are already agreed. That doesn't mean to say I don't think that human rights can't feature in the post-2015 agreement, but the question is quite how, and whether it's more going to be at indicator level rather than targets and goals. The second observation on the papers is also a question about the role of the private sector in all of this. and whether or not we're expecting the post-2015 agreement, which is an agreement between governments, to impose obligations on the private sector directly or through their national governments. And I think that's a question that's still open. The private sector themselves, certainly through UN Global Compact and other organizations, have been engaging with the post-2015 process and put forward some very interesting proposals. But I think there remains a question about whether or not the obligations under the agreement become directly to the private sector or through national governments.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think your question about human rights things will also, and the conventions, the non-binding of the post-2015 and the conventions that our governments have signed up to that are binding, I think goes beyond the human rights also to things like CEDAW and the women's rights issues, the CRC, the lot of things. So I think there is a whole question as to how much, I remember being completely knocked down when I raised this about the MDGs, and I probably get equally knocked down when I'm raising it at a meeting where we're discussing post-2015. But that is an issue. I mean, I feel very strongly that some of this is actually helping to analyze some of the harder, more things that for governments to take that can actually have obliged governments to have a much stronger obligatory thing on governments. So that's an issue well taken. Just a minute, sir. There's one, Christoph. Okay, all right, very quickly then.
It's not going to change any nature of international obligation on human rights, but the problem is that it establishes a linkage. Then it legitimizes the aid. It links the aid and development aid, etc., with the human rights. So this has been opposed by G77 and other developing countries historically. So they are afraid that that kind of linkage may get established. So bilaterally, sometimes it happens, but...
Okay, Christoph, and then Taruka.
Christoph Heiner, working with German Development Corporation, GIZ. And having worked in Nepal for 4 years and just recently returned to Colombo, I was particularly interested in the presentation that you made, Mr. Bhattarai, on community forestry user groups. Now, I recall my first visit to Nepal before the 1990 democratization process, where professionals told me there are 2 social movements that will really show the way towards the new Nepal. One were community forestry user groups, and the other one were the so-called Ama Samuhas, mothers groups. And at that time, the assessment was, if there is chance for democratization, these social forces will transform into political forces and be very instrumental in shaping the new Nepal. Now, having worked in Nepal for the last 4 years and working there in support of the peace ministry, I'm pretty familiar with the process, how the peace ministry is trying hard to give voicing to these 2 forces that 25 years back were seen as the big country. And the results of trying to bring voices to them is more or less disappointing. So I would have 2 questions. My first question, how do you explain that these social forces that seem to be such of high potential, that they haven't really managed to transform into an influence that would allow a constituent assembly to go into land issues, for example? What has limited them? And the second question would be, from your personal experience, how do you see that community forestry groups are able to protect themselves against elite capture and party political influencing? Because that seems to be one of the biggest challenges that they are facing at the moment.
Thank you. We'll ask Taruka, then we'll give you.
Mine was also actually very much related to that. The question of, I know this model is being held up as, you know, a very empowered model for communities, poor communities, but what transformation has it actually brought on to the people? Because I was also in Nepal last year trying to develop a climate change proposal, and it's still being marketed as a tool for the very least developed communities to access natural resources. So okay, if 25 years ago, these communities had access to forests for the 25 years, there should have been some kind of transformation of them in socio-politically, economically. I mean, why aren't they a force strong enough to influence the changes that it's talking about? And also a question for you, Dr. Sabharwal, you mentioned this disaggregated target setting and monitoring for, issues regarding minorities and marginalized. I mean, how do you have any practical examples where it has worked and how it can be contextualized to, say, a regional, a country, a geography? Like.
Okay, before we take another round of questions, can I ask the two presenters and then the panelists to sort of say what they have anything to say? Yeah, maybe you should go first.
Thank you for your question. Actually, the potentiality of forest user groups. First of all, I want to say the background of forest user groups. You see, in the very beginning, the government was not ready to hand over forest to the community. And because of this mobilization of local community, they became agree to hand over those forest area to the community. It means right now we have around 25% of national forest is under the control of forest user groups. It means they are focusing to conserve, protect and manage forest resources rather than involving in the political process. But in the last, the second political movement, we were able to mobilize forest user groups against this, the king's regimes. In that time, all the political parties were agreed to, call to the forest user groups to become a part of the political process. Then we became a success and we got the democratic, republican in the country. So again, when they became in the power, political parties came in the power, they try to, capture the rights of local communities, the forest user groups, right of the forest user groups. Then we again, advocate, we again make a campaign against the political parties, and they were try to, change the Forest Act 1993. Then when we, organized different advocacy campaign, then we stopped to change, to amend the Forest Act. It means, we have that political power. But if you say how we will, involve or engage them for this Constituent Assembly, election, for, which is upcoming in the after 2 weeks, we are not, asking forest user groups to, cast their vote for these or that party or that candidates. But we are just saying that you have rights to choose candidate based on your experience, who are in favor of community rights, who are against the community rights. Then you can choose your candidate and you can cast. That is what we are providing the information, and forest user groups are deciding themselves, and I hope that they will make a good decision. Then they will cast their vote who will in favor of community forestry or community rights. So that is what we are trying to, mobilize people. And regarding the transformation, you see, within a community, you cannot compare with, last 20-25 years ago and now. There was, Nepal was the hierarchical society, and it was very difficult to talk together. The male and female they were not able to sit together, talk together. But now you can see all these forest user groups are dominating by female, means they are in front. They are talking a lot about the forest, and rather than male. In the same times, the poor people are in the driving seat rather than rich people regarding the forest users, forest management plan, development of forest management plan, or like this. It means, there are a lot of changes in community. But if you compare to the national level, in the policy level, we still have to, work a lot, because it is very, very difficult task to transform whole the structure. But we are trying to influence, we are trying to mobilize, those groups who are marginalized, who are poor, because they don't have that access to come to city to, talk with government. But if you see in the village, if you see in the district level, they are the one organization, institution who are being able to influence the process of, district level, the government policy program. They are the one who are changing as per their need. That is the, process the forest user groups are getting, success in this process. And one thing I want to talk about this, the conflict, the military or, company sort of things. If we have a good, the authority, we have the rights from the, act or regulation, and people, they themselves become a very strong. But if they don't have that power, that rights, then they cannot fight with company, they cannot fight with the military. You see, lot of different forest user groups, the government try to, settle military camp in the community forest user groups. But when government decided to, settle the camp of army, then they protect them, they protest them, they protect their forest. Then they removed from the forest area. Army just shifted in the another part of the, area. It means that is what we are getting from our, movement. And regarding this, infrastructure, we have to develop our standard. Like we have a EIA and FSC certification. We are trying to, use those standards in the infrastructure process, so that if they know about this process and they can protect themselves, they can raise these issues. You have to follow the EIA, you have to follow the FSC certification standards. Then, that will help to, protect our forest. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
So I've got some chance to speak, and I'll talk on three things. I would like to also add some comments on the first session that was going on. So especially on economic growth, I'll talk on economic growth, then on the question that you raised, and on private sector, what is happening in India with respect to private sector. So economic growth, we have, I think economics as a discipline has evolved, and from trickle-down theory, there are lots of other new concepts that have come up, which is pro-poor growth. Then recently, the last the decade has seen inclusive growth. So pro-poor growth, what is pro-poor growth? So the way economists have defined pro-poor growth is any growth in mean income that benefits poor. Growth is pro-poor, that it should benefit the poor proportionately more than the non-poor. So that's the second feature of a growth being pro-poor, that the increase in income in current period should be necessarily greater than the preceding period. So that's Osmani. So there's Ravelin that was spoken about. And then most importantly, what really relates to what with respect to discriminated groups and excluded groups, there's a current thinking, which has been said by Clausen, is he emphasized non-discriminatory participation and disadvantage reducing feature as a necessary condition for inclusive growth. So non-discriminatory participation and disadvantage reducing feature of a necessary condition of inclusive growth. So there has been all these thinkings that have come around, and in that context, I think the 11th and the 12th five-year plans have been also informed, since our vice chair, the chairman, Dr. Ahluwalia, is an economist, and he has also debated and written on this. So that's one. Second is about the disaggregated data. In fact, since inclusive growth as an approach was being thought and taken up as an approach to address poverty in India, that's where disaggregated data, tracking of data started being mentioned in the 11th plan. And in the 12th plan, there is a commitment, the approach, the planning process is there, where the Ministry of Statistics are now looking into tracking disaggregated data and development indicators. So that is but it's a start. It's very strange that we've evolved for so long, and we're thinking about these issues now, only recently, of inequality.
Some of us are not thinking about them.
So that's third. The third of the private sector. So the current before even when I wrote this paper, and at that time, this was a debate going on. So Ministry of Corporate Affairs had put out a bill that's called the Corporate Social Responsibility Bill, which makes it mandatory for the private sector to invest their 2% of their profits in CSR initiatives. So that was being debated, and the CSR, and in that bill, they have mentioned it, that these are the sectors that the CSR the profits need to be spent on the CSR, and it includes all the MDG goals, because those are the development goals anyway. So it includes malnutrition, poverty, and infant mortality, all the MDG goals. So 2% of the profit needs to be, and this is for applicable to medium enterprises and large enterprises, and there is a cutoff who will be under this act. So it's an act now, and it's being debated, and I think it's going to be finalized very soon. It's already approved. Yeah. So that's then the private sector, the Confederation of Industries, the Association of Industries adopted affirmative action policy, which is voluntary in nature, in 2007, and this was from the directives of the Prime Minister's office. So it's voluntary in nature, and they have affirmative action to address 4 E's. They call for affirmative action for 4 E's: employment, employability, entrepreneurship, and education. So they have started, the Confederation of Industry has started recording disaggregated data on the social groups of the employers, of the workers, of employees. So that is one step. Employability is increasing employabilities to train, to build skills, training of skills of emerging sectors where jobs are present. So training in those skills. And this is all focused on the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes population and religious minorities and women from the group. So these are the ways the private sector is engaging, and every quarterly they have to report to the Prime Minister's office with the status of affirmative action. And just to add a bit of how our organization has been actually involved in this process of first. How our organization, my research institute, has been undertaking research to understand the processes. Right now, we really don't understand the processes of inclusion, process of exclusion. So a detailed understanding of processes through research for a group-based solution, to address group-based exclusion. So that is what we need, a detailed understanding to understand what to do where, to go to that extra mile to include systematically excluded.
Thank you. Very encouraging. Do the panel, the discussants have anything to add to this discussion? Yeah? Shyama?
Yeah, that's the voluntary because like I said, our organization was involved in first proposing this policy affirmative action, because we did the study where we found wide-scale discrimination in urban labor market access. So we had this audit study where we sent out 5,000 applicants with exactly the similar profile, except their last names and their religion different, and we just waited for the call back. So we found that likelihood of receiving calls for an interview was the lowest for Muslims, slightly better for Dalits, while it was the maximum for upper caste Hindus. And in fact, we sent out applicants with higher qualifications for Dalits and Muslims, and lower for the same jobs, and lower for upper caste. And then this is the study. So this really triggered the debate in the affirmative action. This we did with Princeton University before 2007, and we wanted it to be, compulsory, some form of affirmative action, but it was fine. The way it evolved was voluntary in nature, but regulatory framework was that, mechanism was that regular monitoring from the Prime Minister, straight from the Prime Minister's office. But the incentive is, so for example, the Confederation, there are 3 large chambers of commerce. So one of them is Confederation of Indian Industry. So they have about 6, 7, 8,000 industries registered under there. So they are actually undertaking lots of steps to ensure that these steps, these measures are followed by their member companies. Yeah. So, but it is a gray scale, gray area. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Respond, not really, but that human rights need not necessarily be a standalone goal, but it could be seen as a principle that kind of is overarching and looks at, how the goals and targets are being worded and what is being communicated. And secondly, I guess it was really not about good governance, because good governance, as you said, is more about, bringing in efficiency in government processes, etc. And there have been studies conducted in India by various independent research organizations and INGOs, where they have looked at the systemic constraints and they've said that, instead of focusing on efficiency, it would be important to look at the bottlenecks that constrain implementation. Why does the money not flow down to where it is, where it should be reaching? So I also anyway specifically said that it is just governance that we are looking at. So justice-based process.
Yeah, I have 3 responses, observations to make coming out of the discussion that we had. First, on the human rights approach, to respond to what Dr. Scott raised about whether if we start bringing in human rights discourse at this point into the MDG or SDG conversation, are you going to throw the human rights conventions up for grabs again? Are you going to make them negotiable? I don't think that will happen, because these are conventions, covenants that have been ratified many years ago and which have such a solid sort of base in international law that I don't think they will in any way become negotiable again. But I think you do have a point there, and also the other gentleman, in terms of human rights being used to intervene in other countries. I think we need to keep that a little separate, because I think what we're talking about is really not making human rights, certainly not making adherence to human rights a goal or anything like that when it comes to development, but to ensure that human rights underpins, that all of these covenants and what they're asking nation states to do, states parties to do, actually underpins each and every one of those goals. And I can give you an example which I was just thinking in both the presentations. It actually came out of that just as they were presenting. It just struck me. Both emphasized the question of land rights. I think Taruka and the gentleman there, his question also was on the community forestries model, why haven't you moved beyond point? And one of the areas in which I think more progress could have made is on tenure rights. It seems from what, am I correct? Where land tenure hasn't really been sort of made concrete in the way that you would have wanted. And I think land tenure is a very complex issue, and each country has its own specificities. But if we go back to the morning again, we had Dr. Bhattarai mentioning sustainable agriculture and land use and natural resource management as 2 of the 4 main areas, sort of large, broad areas in which we are going to look to develop the sustainable development goals. Now, if you break that down, and again, this goes back to sort of how specific we can be. So in the morning, we talked about product and process, At this discussion, are we going into process? Are we going into instruments and strategies? Or are we going to just talk about the what we want, like the what as opposed to the how? But then that does mask another whole conversation about, so what do you actually want changed? So if you talk about land use policies, land use plans in most of our countries, and we can talk here obviously of South Asia, that whole system and all of those policies haven't really changed in a way that is pro-poor. And until that happens, how are you going to measure sustainable agriculture goals and where you've gone to. So I think, at some point you need to drill down in the discussion and say, so what are the changes you want to make? And that could be in the indicators, or at some level you need to measure that against actual changes in policy, and then those changes relate to rights, because if you're talking of tenure, you're talking of the land rights of people. And also from what Dr. Sabharwal was saying, and even before that, we can see that in fact, to make a lot of the changes in these goals, we have used laws and regulations in our own countries. So in the morning we talked of the Food Security Act in India. You talked of various other legislations that have come in order to bring about more equality. So I'm not saying that everything that we do at national level to achieve certain goals need to be replicated at international level, and you have to use the stick approach to get people to do this. But I think it does come full circle, and at some point you need to, you have to have a strong regulation or regulatory framework in force to achieve certain of your goals. On the governance issue, just quickly, good governance doesn't ensure that equality is met, but I think it is a necessary, if not a sufficient, prerequisite to get to that. And in the morning we had Deshal talking about the fact that creating fiscal space for social protection is not enough if they are not carried out within a good governance framework. And this has become very much a catchphrase, so I think we need to look at what we mean by good governance. It includes transparency, accountability, all of that. And going back once again to some of the points that Dr. Bhattacharya made about the data revolution. So we are talking about the importance of data, importance of knowledge sharing and information, say north-south. What about, like Priyanthi was saying, between us and the community? If you have transparency, accountability on beneficiary selection, all of that, and then, the minute we talk about that, it's like the feeling is, well, you're going too low. You're going too much to that level, which now we are, at another plane, so we don't want to go there. But I think it's difficult to keep the two separate. And when you're talking of transparency and accountability and good governance, that is actually what you're talking about. So how do you translate your social protection policies into real change and real impact for actual? Okay. Finally, can I just say on the evidence, again, going back to some of the questions in the morning regarding, so how do we move towards creating an evidence base for sustainable or for green growth? And I think some of Dr. Sabharwal's experiences are really interesting because they have actually done that in terms of looking at exclusion and showing how discriminatory practices actually work, and maybe some ideas about how they can be tackled. So I think we have a lot of information around, but it's just sort of going beyond that moral argument to showing that actually growth is important for this generation and not only for the future generations.
Thank you. We have a little bit more time, so yes, and then to Christoph back again.
Just a brief comment, and I'm glad to know that what I was trying to say this morning in the first session about this governance framework, and there's a greater recognition here among the participants here that there is some kind of governance problem here. But let me just enlighten you that the problem is of governance, but not of the idealistic kind of governance with which the Southern Asian states have been always made, evaluated against this accountability, transparency, and all that, which is based on the political theories of modern Western Russian states. What I was essentially trying to say is that we need to look at the actual governance framework, the political landscape, the landscape of governance. How rights and entitlements are negotiated, they are not given for granted. Whatever you talk about the economic, the growth and human rights, access to land, access to education, they all sort of are framed within this governance metrics, which is really about the institutions. And if you look at the institutional landscape, which is the market, the state, and the household, and the community. So this is your institutional landscape. And given the fact that we have imperfect markets in our region, so the rights and entitlements are usually negotiated by the poor. So they are not given for granted. So they have to rely on informal channels of security. And for that we need more research, more analytical research, such as the the Bangladesh reports on the governance report, which they are doing a lot of work on that. So perhaps we need some kind of a report on the governance, state of governance of South Asia. That where we stand here, and that can be then translated into this broader framework of what can be done now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will have a full session tomorrow morning on governance issues, so, and then another one later tomorrow. No, we have almost 2 sessions tomorrow. So let's park that for the moment. We have some really interesting ideas here on governance. But anything else? Yes, Christoph, and then
just a short question of clarification to Ms. Salgado. You mentioned we believe that human rights flow downhill. What did you mean by that?
Well, basically, it's to the poorest poor, the most vulnerable. It's an expression we use, right? Downhill means it goes right down, and it translates to in Sinhala, what do you say, pahala velen thamai watru bahinne kind of thing. So the people right at the bottom are the ones who suffer the most, whether it's in the world of work, for example. The one right at the bottom gets the blame for everything that's done at the top, right? So if rights flow there, then they have a right to stand up and voice their opinion and say, hey man, or hey woman, you right at the top, that's where the problem is. Or express themselves more strongly if they have rights to do it. You see, not as a matter of patronage.
So you didn't mean to establish a natural law that rights will naturally reach those that want.
No, it's an expression that we say. We have to move that rights flow down. Should flow down. Sorry.
I have a question, just an understanding that when you have tried to understand collective action, because there are a lot of studies on collective action, and what is said that when you go for collective action and do not provide substantive or supplement resources and space to the community, it may convert into violence. Yeah. So collective action has shown results on entitlements on various issues and also control. So have you really understood that within the community, when collective action takes place, does it really lead to equity issues, equitable outcome, or within the collective action, within community, you also create north-south divide?
Do you want to straight away answer?
Actually, it is, it depends on the level of understanding of the member of community.
That is a very philosophical statement.
No, actually, it is our experience as well. When we started this process, when people did not have any, understanding about the rights, there was very difficult to, see the collective action. Then when we empowered them, when we mobilized, informed them, then they started, to take a collective action. It means we need to empower, we need to, fully engage them, to aware them about their rights over the resources, especially in the forestry area, for community forestry. What we did, first of all, we provide a lot of information about the importance of forest, their rights over forest, and the legal provision, what is mentioned in the Forest Act. Then when we inform them, then they form their organization themselves. We just facilitate the process. Then when they formed the forest user groups, they registered according to the Forest Act. Then they started to manage their forest. We don't need any support when they handed over to the forest area to the community. Government handed over the community forest area to the community. Then they are managing themselves. They organize meeting. They talk together, make a decision themselves. They are producing firewood, timber, different design, handmade papers, essential oils, and they are selling to the national and international market. It means, first of all, we need to provide a lot of information, and as well as they should have rights over the resources. That right now, our Forest Act providing all the management rights to the people, to the community. Means, first of all, we need rights. Then they need to know, they have the rights. Yes.
An old-fashioned term called conscientization, which was mentioned, I think, I'm probably the only one who remembers it. But yes, here it is a positive, peaceful thing. I'm sure it can actually also lead to confrontation and some kind of conflict as well. Yes. Yeah. Okay.
I want to say that, you know, it was in conflictual situation when the others refuse to listen to the voice, the collective voice of the vulnerable sometimes. But we can. So it's
Yeah, so it's a conversation between different power groups, no? People with different powers, and it's how that conversation happens.
So strength in numbers also helps.
It's on the issue of this, private sector, how to address this issue of, social empowerment. I think, again, it's a question of policy space. Much of the policy space has gone when it comes to transnational corporations, mainly through the bilateral investment treaties. One example I'll tell you is of South Africa. South Africa, it's part of its economic empowerment program. Asked some of the mining companies to dilute some of the foreign holders, investors' stake. Then this Italian mining company initiated an international arbitration against South African government. Of course, they withdrew it afterwards, but now South Africa, this incident basically forced South Africa to have a relook at its bilateral investment treaty. I think when India's this 2% also may come across this problem of bilateral investment treaty, because India's bilateral investment treaty gives absolute right to the foreign investor to take away the profit. So now you are asking them to hold this 2% in India. So it may come in conflict with India's obligation under its bilateral investment treaty. I am a bit alarmist, but there are possibilities of this.
Okay, I'm almost about to close this session. Is there anybody else who wants to say something? Yes.
I just wanted to ask Nidhi whether there is actually, equity is a big topic in the terms of the guiding principles in the MDGs, and they are talking about how to deal with that. But how do you see it fit into the different goals that are already there? You talked about a couple of things about wage disparities. Could that possibly be some sort of a way of measuring the change that was happening? The other one about disaggregated data, do we ask, is that something that we should be demanding in the sense of this is how some of the information should then be produced so that you can actually see what is taking place? And the other issue was on group-based solutions. Are you advocating that something like that should actually go into the whole equality debate? And I also have a question for Bhola in terms of access to natural resources. I mean, it worked with it's working in Nepal in the forestry context. I'm afraid the community forestry is not really working very well in lots of other places. And also, what does something like that mean for other types of resources? Are there ways to talk about access and rights to resources and poor people? Are there other examples that we can use from that relate to other sectors?
Okay, before you answer Karen's questions, I just want to say that there is a tweet which wants to look at a live stream and answer sorry, not a tweet, it's a response to the live streaming. And it's also raising a question that I've been wanting to ask, but from the chair, which is about the whole gender inequality bit. I think Cyrene talked about it, but we didn't really go into the depths of it. This question is how to address gender inequality and absence of women in development debates if we don't talk about patriarchy and structural gender inequality. Now that's a big, I think that's probably another whole session. Yeah, but anyway, just if you have any thoughts on that, first from the speakers and then from the panel. So Karen's two questions, yeah, and this one.
Yeah, those are now, getting to the tasks. So disaggregated data, disaggregation of those aggregated data is the first step. And to see the progress and setting targets for the excluded groups as well, so that no one gets left behind. So first we need to know how many are left behind, so reducing the gap. So first is setting targets by disaggregating the data, reducing the gap between the groups, and then that would mean higher allocation of resources as well to reduce that gap, to reduce that gap. So allocation of resources need to also be allotted in that manner. So that's the 3 ways I think that can go under with. So that's why universal policies, that is general policies of enhancement of addressing poverty, in addition to affirmative action policies. So general policies that take care of the poor, the common factors that are responsible for poverty, and then group specific factors which are responsible for poverty. So for example, for the scheduled caste, it's the position of their caste, of their position in the caste system, which is the lowest. So that is the problem of the scheduled caste, which is not the problem of the tribes, scheduled tribes. Ethnicity might be the problem. So what is the solution? So what to do where? For that, we need to understand the processes of exclusion, of problems that they face. Gender is patriarchy, and when you intersect with group identities, gender becomes even more, the vulnerability increases when you add caste, lower caste onto that patriarchy, or religion onto that patriarchy. So group-based solutions need, group-based exclusion needs group-based solution. But that needs understanding of the processes.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, actually, community forestry is the experience of Nepal. But right now, you see a lot of different countries are also adopting this same process, including, in South Asia, the same act is enacting in India, like Forest Right Act 2005. It is implementing in India. If you see in Pakistan, the different groups are trying to, have a new Forest Act. So there are like Safi and other Sanghi organizations are advocating over that act. If you see in the Vietnam, Thailand, they are adopting community forestry process. If you see in different countries like Tanzania and other country in Africa, they are also, trying to, ask government to have a community forestry in those countries. So it is replicating to other countries. It means it is not, only for the Nepali context. Community forestry is expanding all over the world. That is, what we are learning from different countries as well. Regarding the, the replication of community forestry model in other common resource management, in the context of Nepal, we are trying to, see the community water management by the community. Different community are organizing themselves and they are protecting water resources. They are forming community drinking water user groups. They are forming community irrigation group. Means they are managing water as per the community mobilization. Right now, people are trying to talk about the they are trying to manage barren land. They are forming a land management group and they are managing land within the the community in the approach of community management. But it means this is the way to replicate this community forestry process for other common resource management process.
Thank you very much. It's terrible when the chair has to stop the discussion when it's really heating up. But we started 10 minutes late, so I would like to ask the discussants whether they have any last words that they want to say, even though our time is already up.
Can I say something on the tweeted question?
Yes, of course.
Basically give primacy.
Talk to them.
Basically give primacy to CEDO and DO. I think that's very important, and have an appreciation of the principles entrenched in that. And of course,
No,
what I said
it's
was
being streamed, so they need to hear the voice. So you have to
basically, I would say give primacy to CEDO and the principles entrenched there, as well as DEVO, because that really sets the tone for universal human rights for women. And I don't know, I too am not too aware of what has gone into this bill for victims of crime. There's a proposed victims of crime to set up a fund, Now, for example, in Sri Lanka, I didn't see anything that said, okay, victims of 50% of them are at least women, victims of crime. So let's allocate as mandatory 50% of the funding for victims of gender-based violence or something. You see? So you base it on CEDAW and DEVO, and then you mainstream it into all policy and practice in a country.
Thank you. Any other comments?
So just very briefly, like, I mean, the last round in the MDGs, they did have looked at gender equality and talked of women's representation in political processes, decision making. And now they're talking about inclusion of women, gender security, rights of women to property, girl child, doing away with female feticide and all of those issues, which are all extremely important and relevant. But to see how it can be linked to the national plans and how the whole post-2015 agenda translates into now, since it will be the national governments that will take it forward, that would be a challenge. And that definitely is a very important pillar that needs to be taken into account, even if in countries like Sri Lanka it's not a concern, but most other countries, India, many other countries, it is really, really critical and absolutely important.
Yeah, just very briefly on the tweet, I think the question was specifically about whether you can achieve any of these things without tackling the fundamental questions of patriarchy. So I think that was the question, and I think the simple answer is no. But the slightly more expanded answer is, even though the simple answer is no, how do you then incorporate this into something as high level as the SDGs or the MDGs, and how do you track that? So I think then it's down to some of the things that Shyama and my fellow panelists mentioned about how you track it at the national level and what sorts of measures you can have in place to make sure you dismantle those notions.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry, very sorry I have to stop the discussion now, but let's give our presenters and panelists a round of applause for what I think was a really interesting and stimulating discussion. I hope we can take more of this forward in the future.